Hey, welcome back to Encountered Truth, where we look at the scriptures through a non biased lens and read it for what it says and challenge the status quo. And today we're going to go back into our topic of what if everything we knew was wrong, part two, about Satan's little season, and going into the study. And you'll have to forgive me. Normally I have a canvas up here on this wall, but on this one today I do not. So bear with the flat screen TV and the glare that's just above my head. So apologies for that. But anyway, this one is going to be a more less structured and off the cuff because I want to present the information that I have been studying so that it lays a foundation in which you can use the information in which to study for yourself. And I believe that's important because there are a lot of great videos out there. Whenever I was trying to research, I was looking for videos that gave more of, I guess, concrete evidence. But I know, like, according to scripture, we walk by faith and not by sight. However, man's interpretation, including my own, I am human, which is why we have to prayerfully ask the Holy Spirit to lead and guide us and be with us in our studies. But we have to be willing to challenge the notion of theology as taught to us by men. And so this is going to be more so just off the cuff, looking at what I have been studying over the last week in regards to Satan's little season. Don't take my word for this. Definitely do your own research. I'm just presenting to you because I was once one who believed in the necessity for a third temple to be built, an antichrist to be set up in there, the abomination of desolation, and then a pre-tribulation rapture, and then the 7-year peace treaty in between. However, having a friend over a year ago challenge me, and I had the cognitive dissonance of just wanting to reject and resist the very question before even giving it, why do you think this way? Why do you even consider that this could be a possibility? Despite this verse in Revelation 20, verse 3 being in there. So we know at some point that the little season is going to happen. It's whether or not could we potentially be in that time period or not. And if you haven't gone and watched part one of this video series, I highly encourage you to do that because it will set the stage moving forward. These videos will be in a sequence of order. So do go back and start with part one. This is part two of what if everything we knew was wrong in regards to eschatology or end time prophecy as we know it. I do believe that this will help give you a foundation and a springboard that you can use for your own study material. And by all means, I believe that we're looking at this together. And again, this is my research. So if there's anything that you know or would like to add, please do so. Feel free in the comments. If you disagree with me, that is okay. I was once in the futurist viewpoint and perspective and was so for a long time. I'm 39 years of age, and for many years, having no knowledge that I was heavily steeped into dispensationalism, replacement theology, and Zionism, while even disagreeing with a lot of these statements, not even knowing that a lot of the beliefs that I still held to were trenched into those doctrines. And so we want to look at today a lot of just scriptural evidence, historical evidence, theories, conspiracies, you might say, because I do believe that helps give us the lens and why we see these things the way we do. And so over here, obviously, continuing in part two, and if you haven't seen part one, go back and watch that. I'll put a card up here so that you can link to that video, and I'll leave a description for the playlist in the I'll leave a link for that in the description below, excuse me, so that you can follow along in the sequence of order that I believe these are important. So the little season of Satan, and this is a series that will look at how end times has already happened and rethinking prophecy in history as we know it, and Galatians 4:16. I already know that because I am speaking in this way that it has made a lot of people call me a heretic and that I'm misinterpreting everything, but I just choose to read the Bible literally in terms of what Jesus had said to the people he was speaking to and looking at the contextual evidence of his audience and how it relates to us 2,000 years later. And so, am I therefore become your enemy because I could potentially tell you the truth of something that maybe you have once held so dearly could be wrong? And that is a legitimate question that we should all ask. And so, the main question under the microscope today is this generation shall not pass. What did Jesus really mean here? So we know that he didn't speak in vague timelines. There is one key area that he told us that no man knows the hour. I know a lot of people have commented that. However, when we're looking at exactly what he was referring to in light of what we've been indoctrinated and conditioned to think and believe about end time prophecy will help us because this generation meant his audience, not 2,000 years or thousands of years later. Would a righteous teacher make time specific claims that were not fulfilled? And so we have to make sure we distinguish between what we're referencing here in lieu of the destruction of the temple in AD 70, looking at the Roman emperors that were around in that time, looking at the book of Acts and looking at how the gospel was being advanced in the kingdom of that time, and looking at just how uh, all of these events took place. And here is a lot of scriptural verses that we'll dig into. And again, this is probably going to be a lengthy series because I do want to cover as much ground as possible, but without overwhelm. And so these are for your reference as well. Write these down, take a screenshot, whatever you want to do. And Matthew 24:34, we read about this generation shall not pass. That's what we're wanting to look at and who he is talking to. Matthew 16:28, Mark 9:1, Luke 9:27, whenever he says that some standing here shall not taste death. Luke 21:32, Jesus connects his audience with the end. Matthew 10:23, you will not have gone through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Revelation 1:1 and 1:3, things which must shortly come to pass, and the time is at hand. These are some very critical verses that we want to look into, and I would also add in here Revelation chapter 1 and verse 6. Excuse me, Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, amen. I am Alpha and Omega. So it's interesting that who were those that pierced him? It wasn't me, right? And now a lot of people will say, and I used to also say this as well, is that, well, my sins are what caused him to be pierced. But when he's speaking literally here, that those of that day will see him when he comes back on the clouds. And this is where we have to really look into the extra writings, excuse me, the historical writings of Josephus and Tacitus and Eusebius, because they actually lay out some very interesting events about 70 AD with signs in the heavens, in the clouds, in the skies that had taken place. And this is all important because many Christians today don't really read these historical writings of these one early church fathers, two historians, both secular and religious of their day, Victorinus, Tacitus, Eusebius, and Josephus, because they do give us some key insights into these events that had happened. And we have just been oblivious. When I say we, myself is included in that, for nearly 4 decades of my life, having been brought up into this viewpoint. And so that is another consideration that we must put under the microscope, and also consider the fact that the apostles, they were watching for something, right? And we have to understand what it was that they were watching for. The apostles asked, when will these things happen? And Jesus said it would be in their lifetime. He even told the high priest Caiaphas that you will see the Son of Man coming in Matthew 26:64, which is, why would he tell him that and him not do it? So we have to understand that either A, Jesus is a liar and that we've misinterpreted and put words in his mouth that he didn't say, or we are the ones who could be lying to ourselves about believing the doctrines and the commandments of men, upholding the traditions thereof, which Jesus even rebuked at his time, the scribes and the Pharisees having done so. So how many Christians today justify this delay? Let me move my camera back up here so that you can see. Most people today reinterpret generation as race or future generation, meaning something 2,000 years later. But the Greek word genea, which is Strong's 1074, G 1074, overwhelmingly means a time-based generation of 30 to 40 years. So why twist it? Unless you're trying to protect a failing narrative. And the reason that we might protect a failing narrative is because it's something that we have been conditioned and programmed to believe for many, many years. Like I've said before on my video with, I'll leave a link up here on John Nelson Darby and C.I. Schofield, just about how these two men have shaped the way we view end time prophecy. And then with the Dallas Theological Seminary pumping out preachers and teachers and pastors fulfilling, or I'm sorry, not fulfilling, filling congregations with more of this knowledge all across the United States for, a long, long time. Another comment that I want to speak on briefly is also that of Irenaeus and his against heresies. Now, mind you, again, I'll probably be a little bit all over the place in this video, but bear with me because it's a lot of research that I have been looking at off the cuff here, and a lot of the comments go back to his book Against Heresies, or his works, I should say, which is multiple books in several volumes, Irenaeus Against Heresies. And one of the things I want to talk about Irenaeus in this light is that we need to rethink him in dating of Revelation, because what we know and what we've assumed in much of the late date view of the book of Revelation, usually placed around 95 to 96 AD, is based on a single vague quote by one man, Irenaeus of Lyons, who lived between AD 120 to 202. Yes, he's very respected for preserving early Christian theology, yet his historical accuracy and precision on timelines are much seriously debated. And so some of the problems with relying solely on Irenaeus is that the statement most people quote for a late date revelation comes from his work Against Heresies, as I mentioned, where he mentions that the apocalypse was seen no long time ago, but almost in our generation at the end of the reign of Domitian. But there are several issues with using this quote as proof. It's ambiguous. It's unclear whether Irenaeus meant that John the Apostle saw the vision under Domitian, or whether that he meant that the vision, the book itself, Revelation, was still being discussed or seen during that time. He may have been misquoting or paraphrasing someone else. Irenaeus often relied on oral tradition and second-hand accounts. He claims that Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, relayed these things, but we don't have direct writings from Polycarp saying this, and I do believe that's significant. We just take it for word, which I understand. There are some things that we do that with, but we really need to understand that if we're going to pull a quote from a man's writings where he's pulling from oral tradition, and it's the same way of the Talmudic oral tradition of the oral law that the Orthodox Jews hold to, in that God had given just a oral tradition law to Moses and a written law to Moses. And many people like to say, well, that's not true because we have it in the Old Testament Protestant canon of the written law being given and no mention of such of an oral law. That's just tradition, right? And so in the same view here, we need to hold that into respect as we're reviewing some of this information of what's actually written accounts versus oral tradition being passed down. And now I know sometimes the two can be conflated and views be mixed, but it is important to question. Also with Irenaeus, his credibility on chronology is questionable. Irenaeus famously taught that Jesus lived into his 50s, flatly contradicting the gospel narratives, Roman crucifixion customs, and every other early Christian source that placed Jesus' death in his early 30s. So if Irenaeus was this far off about Jesus' age, should we trust his dating of Revelation being in the mid-90s with blind faith? That's also a important consideration as we look at just when the book of Revelation could have been potentially wrote to these early believers in these seven churches that were really around. And when you go and do Google image searches on these seven churches, they were all destroyed. And so what Irenaeus actually wrote and what it might mean in his book Against Heresies, book 5, chapter 30, he writes, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. If it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, referring to John. For it was seen not very long time since, but almost an hour day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. This quote never clearly says John wrote it under Domitian. It only states that the apocalyptic vision was seen or spoken of during Domitian's reign. Some scholars argue the word seen may refer not to the time of the vision's reception, but when the book itself became known or circulated. So the elephant in the room. Why does John say nothing about the temple's destruction? Well, if Revelation was written around 95 or 96 AD, that means it came 25 years after the most earth-shattering apocalyptic event for the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by Titus. This is really important to consider because why does John, the most Jewish of all apostles, maybe next to Paul, never mention it? Consider this. In Revelation 11, John is told to measure the temple and its worshippers. He's warned that the outer court will be given over to the Gentiles for 42 months. That's 3.5 years. The exact length of the Roman siege from 66 to 70 AD. Now, Gentiles in Hebrew, goyim, is the nations. Well, Rome controlled the whole known world and were the nations. They were the Gentiles. They would be the ones who this would be given over to for this 3.5 year period. If the temple was already a pile of rubble when he wrote this, why speak of it as if it still stood? That doesn't make sense, logically speaking. So we have to be willing to set our bias of what we've been taught aside and actually just question to say, in a humble way, could I have been wrong? And if so, I want to look at this in the lens of, well, what could it mean? Why do people see things in this way? And I used to once be a futurist, and so now I'm more of a literalist and see that in modern term, partial preterism or preterism would be where I fall into. However, those are two other topics that we need to clearly investigate as to what they actually mean and how the early church fathers and the scriptures fall into those two categories. So it makes much more sense that Revelation was penned before 70 AD during a time when the temple was still standing and the judgment upon it was imminent. Exactly what Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So again, going back over here to how many Christians today justify the delay, most people today reinterpret based on Scofield's interpretation on Daniel 9 and the 70-week prophecy. So many people think that his 69 weeks were fulfilled, but there was a pause, and we have the 70th week we're still waiting on. However, when we look at Matthew Henry's commentary, on the 70 weeks, it's very interesting because when we look here, this is something that I was reading the other day, and let me pull up. Remember, just bear with me because y'all are going with me live during this recording. And what I want to do is type in go here, and let's go to Matthew 16. Go back over here. All right, the demand for a sign. So it says, then the Pharisees and Sadducees came and tested Jesus by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied, when evening comes, you say the weather will be fair, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but not the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation demands a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Then he left them and went away. So they wanted a sign. And when we understand, especially when you look into Matthew Henry's commentary about this, it's very interesting to note that the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, when we get in here to verse 5, When they crossed to the other side, the disciples forgot to take bread. Watch out, Jesus told them. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And when we go down to verse 12, it says that then they understood that he was not telling them to beware of the leaven used in bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And why this is important, and when we go back down here to verse 27, we read, "For the Son of Man will come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will repay each one according to his works. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And so when you understand what Matthew Henry, someone who was in the 1700s, in his commentary on this, he says that, "Do you not see that the Messiah is come? The scepter was departed from Judah. Daniel's weeks were just expiring, and yet they regarded it not." I find it very interesting that he says Daniel's weeks, referring to his 70-week prophecy. He believes, just like most of the early church fathers did, that all of the 70 weeks were fulfilled. Not 69 pause, and then we have to wait for this 70th week, as futurism is taught, or as dispensationalism is taught here. And so just something to really ponder when you look into that. The miracles Christ wrought and the gathering of the people to him were plain indications that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, that this was the day of their visitation. There are signs of the times by which wise and upright men are enabled to make moral prognostications, and so far to understand the motions and methods of providence, as from thence to take their measures, and to know what Israel ought to do, as the men of Issachar, as the physician from some certain symptoms finds a crisis formed. Secondly, there are many who are skillful enough in other things, and yet cannot or will not discern the day of their opportunities, and are not aware of the wind when it is fair for them, and so let slip the gale. Thirdly, it is great hypocrisy when we slight the signs of God's ordaining to seek the signs of our own prescribing. Do you not foresee your own ruin coming for rejecting him? You will not entertain the gospel of peace, and can you not evidently discern that hereby you pull an inevitable destruction upon your own heads? Note, it is the undoing of multitudes that they are not aware that will be the end of their refusing Christ. He calls them an adulterous generation because while they professed themselves of the true church and spouse of God, they treacherously departed from him and break their covenants with him. The Pharisees were a generation pure in their own eyes, having the way of an adulterous woman. Proverbs 30, verse 20, "Such is the way of an adulterous woman. She eateth and wipeth her mouth, and saith, I have done no wickedness." Going back, that thinks she has done no wickedness. And so I find that it's a very interesting parallel that Matthew Henry makes, and you can go into looking at on that website, BibleHub.com, and pulling up his commentary on that specific verse and read about it, and even go back into Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, where most people misinterpret there. All right, so what is it more about we read in terms of Revelation? So what we need to consider, so he warned the outer court will be given over to the Gentiles, going back to that, for 42 months, 3.5 years. So it makes much more sense that Revelation was penned before 70 AD, because it was imminent. Exactly what Jesus had prophesied in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Why the 7 churches matter. They were real 7 churches set up in Asia. In Revelation 1:4, John addresses the book specifically to 7 churches in Asia. This detail is often brushed aside, but it's very critical, and here's why. During Paul's missionary journeys in the early 60s AD, he established at least 9 churches in Asia Minor. Colossae, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Ephesus, Smyrna, etc. And around 60 and 61 AD, a massive earthquake devastated Colossae, Hierapolis, and Laodicea. And while Laodicea was the only one that was ever quickly rebuilt, the other 2 were never fully restored, leaving only 7 that were the major active churches in Asia, which is a perfect match for the 7 addressed in Revelation. This narrow window of time between AD 61 and AD 64 fits beautifully with the internal evidence in Revelation and cannot be easily explained if the book was written in the 90s. Now let's go to Philadelphia and the hour of testing. So the message to the church of Philadelphia in Revelation 3, 10, and 11 is perhaps one of the strongest time clues, because Jesus says, "I will also keep you from the hour of testing that is about to come upon the whole world to test those who live on the earth." Now, in terms of the whole world, is he referring to the whole known world at that point in time, not this um, global whole, world? And was the world, and this is another subtopic that we have to look into, is this Pangea, where when you look into Colossians 1:23, I believe it is, and Paul says that the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven. And so if the apostles were able to go and preach the gospel to every creature under heaven during his time, that would make sense that judgment is about to come upon the whole known world of that time. And that could be Rome too, and the whole provinces that were all ruled by Rome, because the whole known world was ruled by Rome. So we have to pay attention to some of these key phrases that are spoken of here. And this warning makes perfect sense in light of the Neronian persecution. This is Emperor Nero, which broke out in AD 64. So if Revelation was written before this time, it would align with the idea of an immediate looming trial and the promise that Jesus would soon come to deliver them. But if this was written in AD 95 or 96, it makes far less sense because that persecution was already history. So when we're looking at this idea that Revelation was written in AD 95 and 96, this hinges almost entirely on one vague second-hand statement from Irenaeus, a man with a flawed track record on dates and facts. Yet the internal evidence of Revelation itself strongly suggests a much earlier date. A temple still standing in chapter 11, 7 churches that only existed together before the AD 61 earthquake, warnings of coming persecution that matched Nero, not Domitian. There's no mention of Jerusalem's destruction, something that would have loomed large if it had already occurred. So if we remove the assumption that Irenaeus was infallible, well, and read the text of Revelation on its own terms, a pre-70 AD date not only becomes possible, it becomes probable. And we have to let the text speak for itself in many cases. And so when we look at the under some of these points I had mentioned about relying solely on Irenaeus, where can we cite that this information is also being quoted by other scholars? So, well, what is it that Irenaeus meant? Because as we looked at, Ante-Nicene Fathers Volume 1, edited by Alexander Roberts and James Donaldson, the ambiguity of his statement is explained in that the Greek phrase translated "that was seen," and I'm not even going to try to pronounce this Greek phrase because I'm not a Greek scholar. I don't know Greek, so take that with a grain of salt. I'm just reading what I research. And this is a passive verb meaning was seen or was observed. The ambiguity is whether it refers to the vision itself being seen by John, the book of Revelation being circulated and read publicly, or someone seeing John himself. Scholars who highlight this ambiguity is Kenneth Gentry in his book Before the Jerusalem Fell in chapter 4, which I've heard great things about, but I have not yet to read, which I want to. F.W. Farrar in his book The Early Days of Christianity on page 387, and then Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History in book 3, chapters 18 through 20, while quoting Irenaeus, shows a dependence on hearsay. And then he may have been paraphrasing or citing tradition, not John himself. So Irenaeus does not claim firsthand knowledge. Instead, he repeatedly appeals to Polycarp, who was allegedly a disciple of John, and claims that this is what he heard in his youth. But we don't have a direct quote from Polycarp in any existing writing that affirms this. Supporting evidence: Irenaeus, in his works against heresies in book 3, chapter 3, verse 4, but Polycarp also was not only instructed by apostles and conversed with many with many who had seen Christ, but was also appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna by apostles in Asia. So we rely entirely on Irenaeus' memory of Polycarp's testimony recorded 60 plus years after John's death. Some scholars who note this are John A.T. Robinson in his book Redating the New Testament on pages 224 through 226, and then again Eusebius in his works Ecclesiastical History, book 5, chapter 20. Even Eusebius cautiously qualifies the accuracy of these hand-me-down traditions. That's very important to consider as well, of how much both Christian and secular historians use Eusebius for early church history. So again, Irenaeus, he wrongly claimed Jesus lived past age 50. This is the clearest example of Irenaeus getting something completely wrong. In his book or works Against Heresies in Book 2, Chapter 22, Irenaeus says, "But from the 40th and 50th year of life, man begins to decline. They declare him to have been a master and teacher only when he was 30 years old, but he did not then manifest himself. He did not preach for 1 year only, nor did he suffer in the 12th month of the year, but was more than 40 years old when he suffered." This is completely unbiblical, as all four Gospels clearly point to Jesus being about 30 when he began his ministry, Luke 3:23, and having a roughly 3-year ministry, putting him in his early 30s at death. So commentaries confirming the error: Philip Schaff, of his History of the Christian Church in Volume 2, Chapter 12, F.W. Farrar, The Life of Christ as Represented in Art, page 49, and J.A.T. Robertson in the book, we mentioned him earlier, Redating the New Testament, on pages 132 through 133. F.W. Farrar writes, "Irenaeus was so confused about the dates that he thought Jesus lived to over 50, a notion no other early Christian writer supports." So those are some things that we really need to keep in consideration as we're looking at the dating and the writing of the book of Revelation itself, because that is very, very important. Some other things that we want to consider whenever we're looking at this here, again, that we touched on last time, Matthew 24, verses 1 through 2. "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And we know that this was fulfilled in AD 70. And then we still have here Jesus quoting the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. And he warns the people that the incoming and imminent danger upon the temple in Jerusalem and the war that was going to incur was at hand. And he's saying, "I pray that your flight not be in the winter nor on a Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, this time, nor ever shall be." Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple, and it happened in 70 AD. So why are we still waiting for a third temple to be built? Is this delay part of the deception? 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was burned to the ground. Over 1 million Jews were killed. Josephus, in his writings, details this. If the Son of Man wasn't if this wasn't a coming of the Son of Man in judgment, then what was it? That is something that we really need to consider. And there were some other cataclysmic events that really surrounded this time that we have to take in for consideration that we'll talk about later. So again, the pattern of suppression. Could Satan's little season be a time of reprogramming the world's memory, ensuring we forget Christ's reign and wait for something that already happened? Let us not be ignorant of his evil schemes and devices. Again, you don't have to believe me just yet on this, or ever. But over the next few episodes, or probably several episodes, I still want to show you scriptural evidence, historical anomalies, and the voices of early church fathers who believed Christ already reigned. And I want you to look for the patterns, not just the theories. And I really want you to see just exactly where this all comes from and how, again, we've been conditioned and programmed to think about this. And some other things for you to really consider and look at. I want you to go look at the city of Dresden before and after World War II bombings. This was a very interesting city that had some really awesome architecture that was built and designed early on. And World War II, a narrative that we believed was stemmed by Nazi Germany. But however, when you look at everywhere that these bombings occurred, especially in Dresden, some really interesting things in regards to the buildings that were blown up, almost as if it was to erase our history. So if the millennial kingdom and reign of Christ, tells us in Revelation 20 that some point after the second coming, and that all these catastrophic events associated with the quote-unquote end times, Jesus will establish his millennial kingdom with the saints, and mortals who survived, presumably, which we are told 6 times in Revelation, will last for 1,000 years. So again, I'm aware that partial preterism and preterism believes this to be a spiritual reign, which is currently ongoing. But personally, I believe, it to have been a physical kingdom that was set up here on earth and lasted a literal 1,000 years. I'm going to read a little bit out of this amazing book here that I learned from Ricardo on his channel, Contend for the Faith, which if you don't know about Ricardo and his channel, go check him out. Him and David Shane have some amazing podcasts, amazing research, have definitely been a great help to my research and pointing me into this direction. But I found this book because he talked about it on one of his channels. I think he was even on an interview with some channel called The Biblical Hitman, and that's where this book was mentioned. And I had to look it up because um, I just wanted to, again, study to show myself approved and not just parrot information that I hear from other people. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to raise awareness about the possibility of Satan's little season actually being around. But I do want to read you some of this here. And there is no author of this book, but so just take a screenshot and look for this. You can pick it up on Amazon. But it says, this is because the millennial reign has a definite beginning and end. The context implies a literal 1,000 years, and also because Revelation 5:10 tells us, quote, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth, end quote. That's not to say the saints won't have been able to move between the physical and spiritual realm in their own glorified bodies, but I believe in essence it was a physical kingdom on earth. At this point, many become confused with questions like, well, but if Christ reigned on earth for 1,000 years, why isn't it in the history books? Or people would just know about it? Or wouldn't it be on the news? Unfortunately, displaying our lifelong indoctrination and programming, in which, again, Satan who goes out to deceive all nations. And in Daniel, it talks about how this antichrist or this figure, could it potentially be Satan, who changes the times and the seasons and the laws at hand, leaving us to not really truly know exactly where we are at in this timeline, only leaving us to truly indoctrinate us on to believe where we are about what we've been told. And so that's when you start to look at what really helped me to see this was another great YouTube channel called My Lunch Break, and how he shows all of these beautiful, immaculate buildings, which I've showed on some of my videos. And we'll take a look at some here that I have pulled up on Google Earth. But this is where the alternative history comes in and the fabrication of our past. Based on these findings of those who have properly studied the subject, it's possible our true history only started around 200 years ago, and everything before that is open to question, and much of it is likely false. The only thing that we can trust is God's word, which he has preserved for us as promised for all this time so we can know the truth. We are told the period known as the Dark Ages lasted 1,000 years, and this roughly coincided with what we are told as the Byzantine Empire. Have you ever looked at the art that depicts that era, where everyone appears to be sporting a halo? And isn't the Dark Ages exactly what Satan would call the millennial reign of Christ, hidden in plain sight as the truth so often is? So, where was Satan during the millennial reign? Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3 tells us, and I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season. All right, so Daniel, it was sealed up until the end times. Revelation is not sealed. It is unsealed during the time it was wrote, which I believe the book of Revelation was probably wrote sometime in the 60s AD. So contrary to what some apparently believe, the Bible doesn't suggest at all that during the millennial reign, Satan is on some kind of leash that allows him to come out of the pit and cause a bit of havoc now and again. It tells us in no uncertain terms that he is locked up with a seal put upon him for the entire 1,000 years. So assuming Jesus returned, as he said he would, the end times has already happened and the millennial reign has already been and gone. Is there any potential evidence of it remaining on earth? Yes, there is. There is plenty of existing evidence all over the world, although much has been destroyed, that there was a highly advanced civilization capable of impossible architecture that lasted right up until the start of our quite recent history, which does not align with the official historical narrative. And this is where we can get into the research of Tartaria. So I want to go back over here and share with you, and then we'll wrap this up here very soon. I didn't want to make this video to be this long, but I do believe it's important to cover a lot of what we're going to get into later on in this series. And so when we go back over here and we look at, this is the Cathedral of Milan, just a fantastic building. And when you look at, let's just go back over here and let's do a quick Google search so that you can see this, that I'm just not trying to pull stuff out of thin air. When was the cathedral? So just look at that. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was built in 1163, a supposed time during the Dark Ages, and yet educational decline. People were dying of wars and famines and pestilence and not even living beyond their 40s. How were they able to build something so just immaculate and amazing? If education was on a rapid downcline, how did these men know the mathematics and geometry of this material, of how to make these? All right, I'm digressing. Let me go back. Cathedral of Milan built. It began in 1386 and was officially completed in 1965, spanning a total of 579 years. Now, it's believable, but I highly doubt that when you look at this structure. And when you go back over here onto the Google Earth, I mean, just incredible. And let's go over here to the 3D image and then a minute to admit. I mean, this thing is just such an amazing structure that we have here. How come more buildings like this aren't being built today when we supposedly have more money, and yet they didn't have? And when you think of also the material that this is built with, and if what did they have to pull this heavy stone, and how has this been able to last 1,000 years? And yet our modern day buildings today don't even last that long at all. And when you look at some of these, the detail of how are they able to get up this high with no cranes, no ladders, weathering the storm, no electricity, no power tool, and just chisel and hammer. Like, these are some interesting things to consider when you look at the detail of this. And there are many structures like this all over the world. I mean, that is just magnificent artwork. Now let's go over here to the Cologne Cathedral. Another just incredible, when you look at the front of this thing. Man, back out a little bit more. I mean, just an incredible piece of work. Just to kind of give you the grandeur of that size. The stained glass, and when you look into the history of the stained glass, and also to make mention, there's no bathrooms or kitchens in any of these. Why would they have no bathrooms or kitchens? I mean, that is incredible detail to the front of this. And we can't even create sculpture like this today. And then St. Peter's Basilica. Just another phenomenal piece of work here. I mean, all of the intricate detail on the inside of how this was carved. And the height of the ceilings from the floor. And the statues that they put place up on here are just also. And yet we're told in the 1800s we lived in wooden shacks and rode on horse and buggies. But yet you have this stuff being designed and constructed in the Dark Ages. There's just certain things that start to don't make sense whenever you look up these old world structures here, and they're all over the place. So I do appreciate you once again, and consider subscribing to the channel if you will. Like and leave a comment below if you find these videos informative and interesting, and they help you in your quest and in your search for where we're at in this timeline and this narrative. Whenever you subscribe to this channel and whenever you like and comment on it, it helps the algorithm push us out there for more people to start questioning the narrative. As my I wouldn't call him my good friend because I don't know him, but Ricardo from Contending for the Faith, his podcast is named. Go check him out over there. And just as a side note about what people say, the fig tree generation that Jesus has mentioned, I've done another video on this. I'll put that up here. And the Balfour Declaration that was in November 2nd, 1917, that was issued by Arthur James Balfour from the British Foreign Secretary. He addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leading British Zionist, and the actual text of the declaration says that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Really interesting because it was Christian Zionism and British leadership, Arthur Balfour and other elites like Prime Minister David Lloyd George were influenced by Christian Zionism, the belief that restoring the Jews to their ancestral land was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. These beliefs came largely from dispensationalist theology like that of John Nelson Darby, which had already taken root in the 1800s. Balfour believed the Jews returning to Palestine was biblically significant. And then there was the Rothschild connection. The letter was sent to Lord Walter Rothschild, part of the powerful Rothschild banking family, who was a key figure in the World Zionist Organization. The Rothschilds were financial backers of many early Zionist settlements in Palestine. The family was known for their immense wealth and influence. There's no official record that they bought the declaration, but their lobbying and financial support were undeniably significant. And that's when we get into the World War I context. Britain was in the middle of World War I, and support from Jewish communities, especially in the US and Russia, was seen as strategically valuable. Some historians argue the declaration was as much about war diplomacy as it was about theology or justice. So the foundations for the modern state of Israel in 1948, the Balfour Declaration, was included in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine in 1922, giving it international legal status. And it eventually led to the establishment of Israel in 1948, viewed by many evangelicals and dispensationalists as a fulfillment of prophecy. So that's a whole nother rabbit trail that you have to understand, that this view comes from geopolitical agendas and false prophecy ties based on John Nelson Darby and C.I. Scofield, something that I haven't touched in this series yet, but something that is equally important. And there is a whole host of scriptures that I still haven't yet covered that we'll continue to unearth, no pun intended, as we dig into the history of where we're at in lieu of the little season. It is important that we understand all of these, and I'll begin to continue working on these videos, but I did want to lay out more of the foundation here as we're moving forward. So this will be built off of number one. This will be a video series that you will want to watch in sequence of order. I'll put part one in the description below. Again, thank you for being here with me, and I hope you enjoy the content below. And please like and subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for the next video in the series.